It might have happened to you that you needed to fill in a questionnaire, maybe when you were at school, or that you received via email for the sake of a specific research, or maybe you hear and read about information that are expressed in terms of numbers or measurements, and maybe you wonder how much can we generalize these results? Like, can they be extended to a wider population? So if you're wondering about these things, or you just want to know more about quantitative research, because this is going to be the topic of this second episode, please keep watching the video after the intro. Welcome everyone, my name is Annette and I'm here to help people to develop an independent interpretation of reality and trying to understand together how spirituality is integrated in our everyday life. So this is the second episode of the series called Behind Papers, where we try to understand and dive into how research is conducted. And as I said in the first video, I had a bit of a background in research thanks to my university. What I'm saying in this series can be considered as like a general understanding of research. Of course, every field has its own strategy, has its own methods, has its own characteristics, but we can make a discussion about the topic of research and trying to understand the background so that we can apply what we learn in these videos to other types of research and being like open-minded and trying to translate the information that I can share here in these videos that are used in other fields. So in the first episode, just quickly saying this, I discussed about what is research in general and what are the criteria that you need to follow when conducting research, or in general like the theoretical background that you have before you start conducting researches, so how you see the world, what you consider to be knowledge and stuff like that. While in this second episode, we're going to talk about quantitative research, which is a specific type of strategy that you can use when conducting research, but it's going to be divided in two parts. And the first one, which is the current video, is going to be about the nature of quantitative research and the preoccupations that we have towards the strategy when we use that. Also some critiques that we can move towards this type of strategy towards quantitative research. As I said before, I mainly base the information I'm sharing with you on a book I used when I was at university that I'm going to link in the description box. But yeah, I also make, of course, considerations from my perspective, so it's just like, together. But if you want to read things firsthand, just check the name of the book and the writer so you can enjoy that by yourself. So what is quantitative research? Quantitative research is a strategy that you use to conduct research. A strategy, we can call it as like a group of elements that are structured in a way that leads you to a result. We can say that. And it's quantitative, so what does it mean and what are its characteristics? When you conduct quantitative research, you want to collect quantities, so collects a type of knowledge that is or is translated into numbers or measurements, being like, for example, when you want to collect age, for example, or you create like a scale and you have to give points. When it comes to the starting point of quantitative research is deductive. So it means that you start with hypotheses, so you start with your theories, what you think you could find, and from there you develop a way to test that result and then hopefully get into that result. Or otherwise you just, change the theory, of course. And it's also a strategy that considers knowledge to be objective. So the idea that you can get to the truth, the idea that something exists out there that can be collected and acknowledged without the influence of subjectivity. And also it's mostly used in natural sciences. So when you study biology or you want to study physics or things like that. As we see, quantitative research is not only a matter of using numbers, so a matter of methods or design, that we explained in the first video what a design is and what methods are. So please check the video so that you can have this background with you. So it's not only a matter of these two elements, it's also a theoretical and philosophical position that you have before conducting quantitative research. So as I said, you want to collect knowledge in the forms of measurements. You want to start with a deductive approach. You see reality as being objective, and you mostly use that in natural sciences. With that being said, of course, when we talk about a strategy like being quantitative or later qualitative research, they're not that fixed. It's just to make a distinction so that we can have a clear understanding of what is one and what is the other strategy, but it doesn't mean that they are so strict or that they cannot be used together. As we will see in later videos, you can actually combine the two types of research, so qualitative and quantitative, and create a mixed methods research. When you conduct quantitative research, it doesn't mean that you're like signing a life sentence and you're not like, oh, that's the only type of strategy that I do believe in. It can be that you think that quantitative research and thus results and like knowledge that is shared, that is produced by quantitative research, is the only one you can trust, or you can only trust qualitative research. It depends, or you can trust both and use both depending on the situation. And especially what is important is acknowledging that each of these strategies has its own flaws, as we will see. So even though you take a side or you don't take a side and you promote both types of research, of both strategies, it's important to acknowledge that they have limits, and we need to be aware of them. So let's first quickly discuss how quantitative research is conducted. And of course, the research process is not linear. You often have to go back to previous steps and maybe adjust something and then keep going and then going back. So it's like an iterative process. Yeah, we can define our way to operate. So first of all, you need to elaborate your theory, and then you divide the theory into hypotheses that you want to test. So as I said before, you start with a deductive approach. So you formulate what you think might happen in reality and that you want to test. So once you have these hypotheses, you decide the design you want to use, and I explained what a design is in the previous video. So whether being like an experimental research or a case study, it depends. After that, you formulate the concepts. So the idea of concepts, or the concept of concepts, is mostly part of social sciences research. But just to briefly address that, we can understand concepts as being like the building blocks of theory, or like a way through which you can organize your ideas. And when it comes to quantitative research, you need to translate these concepts into measurements, because as I said before, quantitative research works with numbers and measurements. Even though I'm not going that deep with this, I want to address one issue that we immediately encounter, and is the idea that we need to summarize somehow reality into concepts, so like into words, so a specific word that needs to express part of reality. But not only that, we need to translate this already summarized reality into measurements. So from that word that summarizes parts of reality, you need to elaborate specific measurements in a way that you're going to collect information about that reality in the form of numbers. And while this is of course necessary to conduct quantitative research, and we need to find a way to collect information, I think it's the first step we need to reflect on, like the idea of translating reality into numbers. So as I said, as much as probably we need that, and as much as I said, we need a way to collect information, we need to be fully aware of the fact that when we talk about results of a specific study, of a research or whatever, when we read, headlines in journals and they express part of our reality in the forms of numbers, we need to realize that those numbers are expressing something much more complex than what we read. Once you have your concepts, you find the methods you want to use, mostly being in forms of questionnaires when it comes to quantitative research. And then you decide the sites where you want to conduct the research, the people that you want to be part of the research, so the sample. So then you administer the questionnaire or the method you decided to use, and then you collect the data, you analyze them, and then you come up with the conclusions. And as I said, this is an iterative process that we will see also later, probably in the second part. The fact that maybe you collect a specific sample, but then you're maybe not satisfied with the amount of people you collected, so you go back and you enlarge your sample, and so you will collect more data, you will analyze again the data, and maybe you come up with different conclusions. So that's what I mean by iterative process, the fact that it's not that straightforward. When conducting a quantitative research, we need to address certain preoccupations. When I say preoccupations, I mean considerations that we need to make when conducting a quantitative research, but it doesn't mean that it's like a whole critique towards quantitative research. It's just we are okay with quantitative research, we are going to conduct that, but we need to pay attention to this. And the first element is the measurements. As I said before, I explained how when it comes to quantitative research, we want to reduce reality into numbers. And to do that, we of course elaborate specific type of measurements, being like, for example, like a scale when we give our opinion, like from 1 to 5, for example. And when we, as I said, summarize reality into measurements, we need to be careful on the type of measurements we use and trying to be as clear as possible and as close as possible to reality. Of course, I think that's the most difficult probably because, I mean, we create measurements, right? It's important to realize that even though we think that we found the measurements that are the closest to reality, we still made them, like humans still made them. It's not that nature gave us a book and be like, oh yeah, that's the measurement that is going to perfectly describing the thing you're studying. We are making them. So of course we appreciate the work of researchers and we hope they're doing their best, even though this doesn't always happen, but yeah, it's another discussion. But let's say they did their best to find the best measurement. Still, it's coming from a subjective opinion. It's coming from people gathering and discussing and coming to this conclusion. So the starting point to analyze that reality, so the measurements in which we summarize reality, it's by nature, I would say, subjective, even though it's considered to be objective. Second preoccupation we need to discuss is causality. So of course, quantitative research wants to find causes and effects, want to find a specific correlation between two elements so that you can have like a clear and neat finding and like, you know, having like finally something that is strictly related. But it doesn't happen in that way. We often hear, especially in natural sciences, about causalities and what causes what and things like that. So it seems that we can have, you know, like reality under control, because if we know what causes something else, we can hopefully work on the cause so that we can have like different effects and stuff like that. But it doesn't always happen in this way. There are, and we will go back to this when we will discuss about statistics and its nature. There are often like third variables that can influence the results, or like elements that we do not consider, like the environment, or, you know, things we're not aware of. Even though like experimental designs are close to finding causalities, and they're like the best type of research to find causes and effects, because you have like the variables under your eyes and you are controlling what is happening and you are planning everything. Still, there's like a degree of error, a degree of something we don't know. The other preoccupation we need to deal with when talking about quantitative research is generalization. Quantitative research often wants to generalize results from a study to like a wider population. That's very difficult to do. First of all, you need to have an appropriate sample that is a random sample, and we will discuss that in the second part of this episode. But even though you have the best sample you could ever have, we still ask, like, is a sample enough to talk about a wide population? Is what we found really a reflection of what other people do. So that's always like, a tricky element, the same as with causality. Generalization is a big aspiration of quantitative research. Still, for the things I've said before, it's not that easy to accomplish. The other preoccupation is replication. As we said before in the first video, it's very important that researchers state all the process they go through, so how they select the sample, what they're studying, like everything they're doing, so that other researchers that want to replicate the same study, maybe to gather more data or like to confirm what the first study found, they have like all the elements to conduct the same study. But even there, it's very hard, because first you need to be transparent and honest on everything you did. And that can be an issue, but we will see that in a future video about like the issue of like transparency and honesty in the research field and in academia. But also it's not always that easy to replicate the same exact study. And of course, if we replicate the study and there are some differences, of course, this will lead to different results probably, or even if it will lead to similar results, the elements of the research were different. So always like trying to compare and be like, oh, we had different results, why? Oh, we had different process, why? What does it mean? And trying to, reflect on this. So now that we dealt with the preoccupations in quantitative research, we are going to discuss 4 critiques that are moved towards quantitative research. It comes to the first critique from people in the field and like people that discuss these topics, is that when you use quantitative research also for the social world, so using that in social sciences and not only in natural sciences, it means that you would consider the social world as being the same as nature, while for this position, these two realities are different, because nature is considered to be more, objective, regular, and I would say static, in the sense that it's there and it doesn't really change, in the sense that it keeps repeating itself. So then using a quantitative research could be more appropriate. While when you use quantitative research to study the social world, then we go back to the issue that I mentioned before, so that you have to translate whole reality into measurements, and then it's not the same. So the social world is also made up of meanings and personal interpretations and subjectivity, so then it would be hard to think that nature is the same as the social world, that you can apply quantitative research to both. The second critique relates to the first one, but they are more or less all related, and it's about the measurements, so that people that critique quantitative research think that measurements are artificial, are static, so that they don't portray reality as it is. And the consequence is that when you use these measurements, and we know that they portray reality in a static way, while reality is much more complex and has meanings that people attribute to reality, the result is that when people answer these questionnaires, they probably have a personal interpretation of that measurement, and probably what they think is not the same as the researcher thinks. Or maybe it happens, they think the same, but it doesn't always happen. So the answers that respondents are going to give is based on how they see the measurements, how they think the measurement represents reality, and not probably what the researcher was thinking when he made up the measurement. So there's also this degree of difference between not only the way measurements reflect reality, so not only the fact that they are artificial and they are constructed, but also how respondents interpret that. And of course, this has a huge influence on the results we have. The third critique considers the fact that when respondents are part of the quantitative research, they are, of course, in an artificial environment, so they are going to answer questions and they are going to think about the meaning of the words that are used, or what the researcher is asking, or whatever. But still, there might be a difference, there might be a distance between what they answer when being part of the research and what they would actually do then in real life. So there might be this distance, but not only because maybe they don't feel like they want to answer truthfully, and yeah, so they don't want to really say how they would act in real life, but also because the environment of our research is artificial. So maybe it also influences the way you are thinking and the way you think you would act without doing that on purpose. You give an answer that doesn't really reflect what you would do in real life. And of course, then you will give your answers, and then it leads to results, it leads to knowledge, and then it doesn't really reflect how reality works. The last critique is still about causality and the fact that who criticizes quantitative research thinks that causality is a static way of seeing reality. So even, as I said before, in the preoccupations, and I know like the preoccupations I discussed before are similar to the critiques I'm making, but the critiques go a bit deeper, because before with the preoccupation we were like, yeah, we need to be aware and we need to be careful, but we can still, trying to find causalities, even though, as I said, we need to then explain that there might be other variables or whatever. While the critique says, well, I mean, it's just reflecting reality in a way that it's completely fake. It's not how reality works. Reality is much more complex. Reality is much more dynamic. We discuss what quantitative research is, how it is structured, and we went through the preoccupations and the critiques of quantitative research. What is important is that even though researchers can try their best and they want to do things properly and following the instructions and following the methods they need to use, there is still a degree of error. So there's no point to only, demonize quantitative research. You can either support or reject that, but what is important is to realize that there are these preoccupations that we need to address, that we need to think of, and that, of course, appear as well in the results. So it's not only, the process, it's the results themselves depend on the process. So when we read researches, when we need information, news, or whatever that come from this type of research, we need to think that it's not the truth coming from heaven, it's just knowledge that's been built by humans, and as much as they try to be reliable, honest, or whatever, it's still going, like the results are still coming through this whole process. With that being said, we now end the first part of the second episode about quantitative research, and the next video will be more about the samples and a couple of methods we can use in quantitative research. Would be, I think, questionnaire and interviews. We will again, discuss and reflect on these topics. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video and it was clear, and you're looking forward for the second part. And with that being said, please subscribe to the channel, it would really help me out, and also click the notification bell so that you won't miss any other video. And I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!